there was a huge debate about whether to tear down the freeway. And we used to laughingly call ourselves low-level, powerless bureaucrats because we were not in a position to, uh, talk to the city board of supervisors. And as a city staff person, you have to kind of be discreet. You can't like just shoot your mouth off because you're
Yeah.
not a citizen. But well, we got rid of the Embarcadero Freeway. That was a big success.
If you've ever walked past San Francisco's Ferry Building and thought, this is a nice place to be, well, then you probably didn't know that for almost 30 years, there was a double-decker freeway that blocked the water. The story of the earthquake that cracked it is famous, but the story of the people inside City Hall who helped tear it down completely is less famous. Jack Lucero Fleck is one of those people. He spent decades inside the transportation system, starting as a draftsman, and he retired as the 5th city traffic engineer in San Francisco's history. He described himself and his colleagues as, quote, low-level, powerless bureaucrats. After this conversation, I'm not so sure they were. This was a live interview recorded during San Francisco Climate Week with an audience that joined for Q&A at the end. This episode of Any Job Can Be a Climate Job was filmed in collaboration with the Climate Action Resource Library. I'm Louisa Henry, and here's my conversation with Jack. Thanks so much, Shruti, and thank you all for being here. I really appreciate it. And Jack, thank you especially. I'm really excited to dive into this conversation with you. I would love to just start at the earthquake, like 1989 Loma Prieta earthquake. It damages the Embarcadero Freeway. Why don't you tell us about that? Like, just take us back to that time and share what was going on.
So this is the Embarcadero Freeway. Just imagine the ferry building completely shrouded by this huge monstrosity that completely dominated the waterfront in San Francisco. The idea was this was just going to be part of a huge network of freeways that was just going to zigzag all over the city.
Oh my gosh.
I mean, can you imagine San Francisco if there were freeways like this? If this is like 3 or 4 levels of freeways. So I did take a picture when it was being, right before it got demolished. This is what south of Market looked like. I mean,
Wow.
It's like, you can't imagine that it's the same place. I mean, this is like a totally blighted, disgusting environment that was completely dominated by the freeway.
That's
And,
insane.
Today it's kind of a vital, interesting spot. That's what I wanted to show you. And,
Yeah, that thank you for taking us through that and for sharing those photos. I had never seen that before. I came after the earthquake, and so I had heard about it, but not known about what it looked like. And can you tell me a little bit more about why, like you said, it was just kind of, dilapidated or just not, it doesn't look as beautiful as Soma does today. But tell me more about why, you were against rebuilding the freeway.
That's a long question. I can tell you. Can I give you the long answer?
Please.
Okay, because, well, the short answer is it was just pretty horrible. Like it really caused all this blight and disruption. But I was a traffic engineer, and a lot of traffic engineers were like into freeways. They liked that kind of stuff.
Wait, what's a traffic engineer? Like, what is that job description?
So our responsibility is to manage traffic control devices, traffic signals, traffic signs, the pavement markings like the striping on the street, parking meters, anything, the color curbs. It's a lot of nuts and bolts, of what kind of keeps San Francisco or any city moving, and you sort of don't pay any attention to it until you get a ticket or something, or if the striping isn't there and you get confused about what lane you're supposed to be in, things like that. But otherwise, you kind of ignore it. Or if the signal timing isn't working well and you go from one light and you hit the red and then you hit the next one, I mean, that's pretty annoying. So
yeah,
it's sort of like you as a traffic engineer, you sort of hope people don't notice you because you sort of like the umpire in the baseball game.
Right. So everything's running smoothly if you're doing your job well. Got it.
Yeah. The way I got into it was a very roundabout way, very circuitous. So what happened was in 1965, I graduated from high school, and I wasn't sure what I wanted to do. I did know I wanted to do something with science because I was one of these kids that was affected by the Sputnik. The Soviet Union launched a satellite called Sputnik in 1957 or something like that, and it freaked out the U.S. because we realized the U.S. was way behind on science, that we had no way to, we entered the space race. So I got caught up in that, that schools at that time. So it always amazes me that the Republican Party today is so anti-science, because at that time it was a very bipartisan thing. Everybody was for science and everybody was trying to, push that. And I was in Peoria, Illinois. My parents were Republicans. They were like giving me science books, and that was what I really liked. But I didn't know what I really wanted to do. And in the summer of '65, a big thing happened in Los Angeles, which was called the Watts riots. And it was the Rodney King riots in the '90s. You might remember that.
Yep.
And then I think all of us know the George Floyd situation in 2020. So like it was pretty much the same kind of thing, where the whole section of Los Angeles had a huge uprising, and people were basically burning the whole city. And here I am in Peoria, graduating from high school and looking at this and thinking, wow, people must be really upset if they're burning down their own neighborhoods. I mean, so the typical reaction of a lot of my friends is, well, they should just take those rioters and shoot them, or something like that, but I didn't quite think that way. And so I decided to go into transportation as an engineer, but with a focus on city planning. So all through the '60s, I watched as the cities all across the country were erupting in these riots. They called them long, hot summers. And as I was studying transportation, I began to realize, well, there was a part of the transportation system that was responsible, because I studied Chicago a lot because that was the big city near where I lived. And there were freeways that were zigzagging, like those ones that were supposedly, that never happened in San Francisco, but they were built in Chicago. And they did destroy a lot of neighborhoods. And at the same time, there was no open housing laws. So, white flight was going on. People were moving to the suburbs, but the inner cities were completely segregated. And, it was like a pressure cooker, and they exploded. So it was like city after city would have these riots. But there was one city that in 1967 had something different, and that was San Francisco. San Francisco in 1967 had what was called the Summer of Love. And I was like also paying attention to that. It's like, they're really onto something out there, That sounds pretty cool. So I wanted to be part of that. So I got eventually into city planning school at Berkeley, and I was pretty much against the automobile, but not because of climate. I'd never heard of climate change at that time.
So you're a traffic engineer against the automobile.
Right. So I graduated like becoming more and more against the automobile, but especially after I'd gone through Berkeley, where in city planning, because there was city planners typically tended to be much more anti-auto than most traffic engineers. But anyway, so I did come away. My first job out of city planning school was in Berkeley. Saba, if you live in Berkeley, you're very familiar. They've got traffic diverters all over town. And those were the ones, that was my project, to try to protect neighborhoods from traffic by putting in these traffic diverters. And they were very controversial. Like there were some people that were really upset about having to go out of their way because these traffic diverters bothered them and stuff. And so I ended up being kind of gun-shy to even mention that I worked on that project, because it wasn't necessarily a left-wing or a right-wing thing. It's like certain people just felt that the traffic diverters were in their way.
How does help me understand how traffic diverting helps with traffic?
It doesn't help traffic. It keeps it out of the neighborhood. So like,
keeps it out of the neighborhood. So that was part of like the goals of being a city a traffic engineer, was to keep traffic out of the neighborhood.
In the South Campus area, there's two streets, Fulton and Ellsworth, that were one-way streets, and they were really fast. They didn't have any stop signs. People just flew down those streets.
Yeah.
We had demonstrations and protests, and finally we got the city to put in these traffic diverters, because there are streets parallel, like Shattuck and Telegraph, where the traffic should be. It shouldn't be on these residential streets.
Got it.
So I had that whole history, and then this was still during the war, the Vietnam War, and I was very much an anti-war activist, and I got involved in all sorts of other things. Didn't even stay with city planning or civil engineering, just kind of moved on in my life because I was like much more involved in being an activist. But I did have some friends who worked for the San Francisco Civil Service Commission, and I had a job as a bookkeeper in San Francisco, and they said, "Jack, you ought to take this civil service exam and get on the list here for this draftsman job." And I said, "Oh,
Okay, what's
okay,
a
that's
draftsman?
okay." So that you just make if you're going to make a change in the striping drawing for a striping drawing shows like where all the lane lines are, and
Okay.
it's sort of like details what goes on a street. And if you're going to make a change, in that day, it was all done with pencil and vellum paper, and so somebody would have to erase what was there before and make a new drawing and put it on paper. So that was a draftsman's job,
Okay,
and
got it.
like the first thing I remember, I felt so powerful because I just made a KC on a drawing, and that stood for keep clear. It was in front of a firehouse, and so we sent it down to the paint shop, and a week later, they came out and painted "Keep Clear" on the pavement, and I was like, "Oh, wow, this is really cool." I made a big change.
Your first taste of some power here.
Yeah, really.
So fast forward a little bit. Tell us a little bit more about
Okay, so that
how.
was
Yeah.
I got that job with the city, and it was a total coincidence that, I got on with the traffic engineering department because there are dozens of places I could have ended up as a draftsman in the water department or the sewers or anything else, but I ended up in traffic, which is the one subject I knew a lot about, and, when I went in for the interview for the job, I remember they looked at my resume, kinda, "It's kind of an oddball resume here," but then the guy that was interviewing me, he was an old crusty traffic engineer, he said, "Oh, yeah, city planning, that'll ruin anybody." And so he took into account that, okay, well, he's coming back to traffic, that's good. And so, I eventually got on the junior engineer list, and I became a licensed engineer. So by 1989, I was a associate engineer, and I was actually working in the planning section, but there weren't any big ambitious jobs that we were doing that I can remember. I honestly don't remember, but all of a sudden, when the earthquake happened, everything changed because
Mm,
now for years, people had talked about getting rid of the Embarcadero Freeway, but, one of the questions they always asked was, "Where will the traffic go?" Well,
right.
and that became our job, is to figure out where the traffic would go.
So was there already a plan for where the traffic would go before the earthquake?
Nobody knew, but once the freeway was damaged because of the earthquake, we knew right away because you could see where the traffic went.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
And so we put counters out and we mapped it. Now there was a myth that the traffic just disappeared. Well, that was not true. It did not disappear.
Hmm.
But San Francisco, the engineers were so gung ho about moving traffic that they had created all these one-way streets like Folsom and Howard and all the north-south streets, First and Bryant and Beale and Third and Fourth and
Yeah, I've
Seventh.
always wondered why those are one way.
They're all one-way streets, and one-way streets like that carry a lot more traffic. So what happened was we noticed that, yeah, all that traffic from the Embarcadero Freeway ended up on the streets, but they actually handled the traffic pretty well,
Hmm.
except in the afternoon rush hour, which would back up. But the old Embarcadero Freeway used to back up too, so it really didn't, it just meant that traffic was backing up on the street as opposed to on the freeway. So our argument, which we were part of, was that the surface streets could provide quote unquote comparable capacity. That was the key word.
Hmm. Okay.
And so there was a huge debate about whether to tear down the freeway. And, of course, I was a traffic we used to laughingly call ourselves low-level powerless bureaucrats because we were not in a position to, talk to the city, board of supervisors. We weren't, and as a city staff person, you have to kind of be discreet. You can't, like, just shoot your mouth off because you're
Yeah.
not a citizen. But, the main group that was in support of rebuilding the freeway was, Chinatown.
I want to pause. And I do want to get into that because that's really fascinating. So you're a traffic engineer, you're working on, keeping the flow of traffic. Everybody just assumes the freeway is going to be the best way to do it. It seems like you're coming from city planning in these other areas too, where you're like, wait, we need to build livable cities where people can be pedestrians and people can live and work and not just optimize every road for cars. Um, and then there's the climate angle too. Can you tell us like why Why would it be bad for climate to have a freeway?
I was pretty much an traffic engineer, but I did like it when I realized I could get a job with San Francisco, because San Francisco had what was called a transit first policy, and that was adopted in 1973, way before I started. I started with the city in 1985, but I realized that gave me leverage, because if there were ever an argument about taking out parking to put in a bus lane or something like that, I could say, well, but the city has a transit first policy.
Uh-huh.
So the climate now, again, there was no climate argument at that time, but just the livability and, anti-automobile, and there was a big connection between oil and imperialism and the Vietnam War. I mean, the whole Vietnam War there was no oil in Vietnam, but there was a lot in Indonesia, and there was this domino theory that if we don't stop them now, they're gonna get our oil, does
Mm.
that sound familiar? It's like the same thing that we're doing in Iran, these wars for oil. So that
Yeah.
climate connection did exist way back then, but now with climate, it's even stronger, that the connection of trying to get people out of their cars and onto bikes and walking and living in a livable, city that's not so auto-dominated, yeah.
Could somebody make the argument that if you just built a freeway, over San Francisco, there would be less cars on the street because the people who need to get across can just get across quickly? How does that play out?
Well, in a way, that's true, because, one of the things that I worked on in my career in San Francisco was trying to put bike lanes, and, we put the light rail on 3rd Street, we put bike lanes on Potrero. Now those were the main north-south streets before the freeway was built. But once the freeway was built, the traffic was not so heavy on those streets, so you could do a more livable design on those streets. So
Yeah.
there is some truth to that, and that, I think, happens a lot in, Oakland, where the freeways there were a lot of streets that were built to be wide and hold lot telegraph, for example, and now they put in bike lanes and bus lanes and all that kind of stuff that
Mhm.
wouldn't be possible if it weren't for the freeway. So in a way, there is some truth, as much as I don't like the freeways.
Yeah, and something you said back, that you were, San Francisco was did you say a transit city? Transit first city?
Transit first policy, yeah, they had a transit
Policy.
first policy.
Yeah. Yeah, that's really key, I think, because, in talking with a lot of guests that I have on the show, being able to anchor what you're trying to do to some, policy or belief or, principles or goals that the company you work for have is like a very, very strong place to start, because then it's a lot more aligned conversation and you're hitting less headwinds. So I just wanted to call that out.
Yeah, so I was thankful that I was working in San Francisco, and I was always
Yeah.
happy about that.
Okay, so tell us about Chinatown.
Well, okay, so we left it that there's this disaster, the earthquake, that has a kind of a positive side, which it didn't kill anybody in San Francisco. It did, unfortunately, in Oakland. But
Mm,
in San Francisco, it just damaged the, old Embarcadero Freeway enough that it had to be torn down and rebuilt. Well, by the fact that we could document that there was comparable capacity on the streets, we were making the argument it didn't need to be rebuilt. And of course,
right.
lots of people didn't wanna rebuild it because it was horrible. It was ugly.
Yeah.
And yet there was a very strong constituency that did want it rebuilt, and that was primarily led by Rose Pak in Chinatown, and she was the head of the Chinese Chamber of Commerce, and she did an amazing thing. When it came to a vote at the Board of Supervisors, the day they were gonna vote on whether to tear this thing down, she got every business in Chinatown to close and go over to City Hall. Now just think about how
Wow.
hard that would be to organize something like that.
Yeah, that is
She
a powerful person
she
to
pulled
be
that
able to.
off. So, I always, in spite of the fact that I totally disagreed with her, I always respected Rose Pak. In fact, I walked over to City Hall that day just to see what was going on, and it was unbelievable. I mean, I'd been to the Board of Supervisors quite often when there were big crowds in the
Yeah.
board room, maybe even full. But this wasn't like that. This was like the whole city hall was full. I mean, the steps, the whole under the big dome, the whole landing, it was packed. It was
Wow.
completely full. And these were all people that were demanding that they rebuild the Embarcadero Freeway. Now you can imagine the pressure then the Board of Supervisors is under with that
Absolutely.
kind of organizing against them. And so the final vote was 6-5 to tear it down.
Wow. That is close.
And I I remember there were a couple of members of the board who, for years afterwards, they were always lecturing us traffic engineers. Like it was all just for show, but they would say, my boss was Mr. Yee. Mr. Yee, I am extremely disappointed that you're not getting that traffic moving better. It's like, and so they always wanted us to get the traffic moving better just to prove our statement that there was comparable capacity. But
Oh my gosh.
it was actually very contentious. And in that slide that I showed of the freeway ramps that led up to the Embarcadero, that's actually where I got more involved, because that whole structure was called the terminal separator structure, the one that I showed you on that picture I
The
showed.
terminal, the one with the two ends, and it like it was getting ready.
That's
the
the
tall one?
Embarcadero. The one that had all the different layers of freeways all jumbled up on top of each other.
Yeah.
In the south of Market, right there at Beale and Folsom, where I showed you that picture.
Uh-huh.
That was a separate vote. And so, even though they had voted to tear down the Embarcadero, Caltrans went ahead and redesigned that whole thing, because it was also damaged and it was all ready to be torn down, but it was going to be
Wait,
rebuilt.
why, how could that be a separate vote? Like, if you have a terminal separator, those are to, like, move people on
Because it
different
was
freeways.
the freeway, the vote on the Embarcadero was to tear this piece down. Now, there was a ramp that went over to Chinatown here, and there was a ramp to Broadway. Those all had to be torn down too. But there was some debate still about all of this stuff in the south of Market with these two ramps. This was like the Main Street ramp, the Beale Street ramp. There were a couple other ramps underneath here. And there was like the idea, well, this would just stay like this, and it would come down to a grade here. So they would get rid of the Embarcadero Freeway, but they wouldn't get rid of all this, which was called the terminal separator structure. And my argument was like, this doesn't go anywhere. Why would you build something? And I think I was pointing out, it took that all of that takes up 11 acres of incredibly valuable
11 acres.
valuable city property. And of course, the redevelopment agency was really on our side. They really.
Oh yeah, I can only imagine like the way that everybody was lobbying for one way or the other.
Developed in such a dynamic way now, that it just completely has changed that whole area. I mean, this was all like blighted because nobody would want to be walking around underneath this big, ugly, noisy.
No, right.
And now it's all, lots of development. So it wasn't quite as contentious as the vote that the Embarcadero Freeway had, but Caltrans, had gone ahead full steam, and they had completely redesigned it. They were ready to go to bid, and there was one vote that was going to happen at the Board of Supervisors where they had to make the decision. And fortunately, they voted, I think it was 7-2 in that case, that they would not rebuild it. And but Caltrans had spent a lot of money doing the redesign, so they were really ready to go. And but San Francisco said no. So I'm very thankful that they did that.
Yeah, what an alternate reality we would be living in right now, for sure.
It's just a much better city to not have it. That's my feeling. And as far as how it's related to climate, I mean, it does encourage more people to drive, to have, that freeway there. It wasn't that big a deal. It was only like 3% fewer people would drive. It wasn't going to shift that many more people. At least that's what the model said, and I kind of was impressed that I think they were pretty accurate, they nailed it pretty much. The models are based on travel time. They say if people choose their mode, meaning whether they go by walk or bike or bus or car, by travel time is the main thing. And, if they can do it just as fast by bus, they'll take the bus. But if it takes them twice as long, they're going to try to drive.
That makes sense.
So the models pretty much estimated that it would be like a 3% drop in traffic. And that was about, it was hard for us to get exact because traffic counts and stuff like that are not exact. Like I said, the traffic didn't disappear, but it probably did drop a little bit. Not enough to really be measured.
So broadening this out to transportation in general. If somebody listening is working for a company, like 500 plus employees, a pretty big size company, has a parking lot, like how might they be pushing for alternative ways of commuting? Trying to get some of those cars off the street. What are the
Yeah,
most high
there are
leverage
a
moves?
lot of big companies and cities that have transit incentive programs. So they would give people subsidies for their bus passes, especially if they're providing parking. Then you can make a pretty good case as an employee. Like, wait a minute, you gave somebody parking, you should give me a bus pass. Because it's
Mm-hmm.
only equitable. And there's also policies within parking. I think Stanford had a really good thing they called a fee bait. So, like, the people that would pay a fee to park, if you came in by yourself, single
Yeah,
occupants vehicle, you'd pay a high fee. But if you came in a carpool, you could actually get paid some money because the people that paid the fee goes. In other words, it's just the money is a net zero.
that makes sense. So those types of incentive programs have been around for a while, but from what I understand, adoption isn't super high of them. Why do you think that is? Like money or
Well,
awareness,
again,
something
people
else?
take the path of least resistance in terms of travel time. If they feel like transit is gonna take them a lot longer,
Right.
they still wanna drive even if they're gonna get paid a little bit or even if the pass is free. So, especially in suburbs, low density environments, that's a
Mm,
really a big challenge. San Francisco, it works pretty well. It at least now it changed also with COVID with a lot of telecommuting. That's a whole other way to
absolutely.
uh,
Yeah.
save in greenhouse gases by just working from home. So that's another development.
Yeah, that's really interesting because I know right now there's a lot of funding challenges with Muni and BART, public transit here in San Francisco. It's up against some headwinds. I'm not sure if people think about that as being like a climate lover. Like, having public transportation is taking these cars off the street, is making things more usable, more, um, less carbon in the air, and then more livable cities in general.
Yeah, that there's the term in planning is called vehicle miles traveled. And so the goal is to reduce vehicle miles traveled, and they can do that by all sorts of ways. But transit, of course, is one of the main ones, and um, walking and biking. And one of the main things to be done is infill housing. Like if you build housing that's near the transit lines and higher density, then you encourage people drive like half as much if they live in a transit oriented community than if they live in a suburban sprawling community. So
Are there solutions for suburban sprawling communities? Do you have any advice for people who live in those cities and want to impact their
um,
transportation?
to me, the best solution is electric vehicles because you're probably going to end up driving e-bikes. I really think that could work for a lot of people for a lot of trips. And then the other thing about if there were a way to do, shared electric vehicles, I mean, that would be ultimately having one person per vehicle is just totally inefficient and wasteful. So if
Right.
there were a way to get people to share somehow,
Like
that
carpooling.
yeah, carpooling for sure for work trips, but,
Mhm.
I don't know. That's a big challenge. I think we first of all have to stop sprawl because it's kind of the opposite of what is gonna be more ecologically supportable, not just because of the greenhouse gases from transportation, but just the impacts on the land and everything else. But,
Yeah.
so if we can contain the sprawl and make the cities higher density and more livable, that's always been kind of ever since I was in city planning, that's always what I, kind of wanted to do.
Have you been successful at that in your eyes?
Well, we got rid of the Embarcadero Freeway. That was
You
a big
did.
success.
That is huge.
Actually, my other I got to be pretty good friends with Rose Pack because she
Mm.
never knew how anti-freeway I was, but, as a city bureaucrat, I was just really careful with her because I knew she was powerful, and we kinda worked on her, and she eventually switched over to supporting the Central Subway and the 3rd Street Light Rail, and she was buddies with Nancy Pelosi, and she, got the federal government to cough up, I think $1 billion to pay for the Central Subway, so, you know
Amazing.
that's why she has a station named after her in the Chinatown Central Subway station.
Yeah.
So yeah, she became like an ally then, on that issue, which I also supported because I thought that was the kind of development we need is, you know, transit kind of stuff.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's a really nice story too, because, even though somebody was pushing for one direction, it sounds like the conversations, came to the table and there was an ability to see from different sides and then to ultimately get to a place now where we have that central subway, which probably wouldn't be there if we still had the Embarcadero Freeway.
We kind of sold her on it as like, "Look, you're not gonna get the freeway, but you can do this, and this is gonna help Chinatown have the kind of access." Because the old 30 Stockton bus quite often was completely packed, it's really hard and if you think about getting on a bus that's already packed and having how long it takes, it was a lot of delay just as opposed to a subway, where all the doors open, it's all level boarding,
Right.
people come on and off, there's no delay at all, you just have 20, 30 seconds, and then you're on your way again.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. It's all very automated and timely. That's nice.
yeah.
If somebody listening is trying to think about how, if they're on their commute tomorrow morning and they're listening to this, what's the first thing they should do this week? Or how should they think about their ability to impact the future?
You mean
What advice do you have?
transportation or
In
just general?
transportation and in general.
Oh my. Well, I after I retired, I became an activist with 350 Bay Area because I sort of jokingly told people my 2 goals when I retired was, to solve global warming and clean up the house, and
Oh,
cleaning
yeah,
up the
yeah,
house
2
has been
big
the
goals.
most challenging one, yeah.
Oh, good. Okay, so yeah, tell us how we solve global warming, please.
Well, I mean, it's really not complicated. We just have to get rid of fossil fuels. I mean, that's it's really about that simple. And unfortunately, if it weren't for the oil lobby and the misinformation and all the technology is here. Solar panels and um, electric vehicles and the possibility of funding for public transportation instead of going to war for more oil. We're spending our money on the exact wrong things, so it's all a policy. The reasons we still have climate change are all policy decisions being made by the government, being, sort of, lobbied by big oil to keep digging ourselves deeper into the hole we're in. But,
So is
yeah,
that your
I think
advice? Get involved in policy?
I would say, yeah, that's 350 Bay Area has a 350 Bay Area Action, which is endorses candidates and lobbies for and California has done some good things. We've got the uh, goal of being carbon neutral by 2045. The governor signed an executive order saying that we wouldn't sell any fossil fuel vehicles after 2035. Now he's under attack, and of course. Um, he's probably kind of being quiet about that now that he's running for president,
Yeah.
but, that's a good goal. We'd like to hang on to that, and,
Yeah.
there are other good things that the state has done, other things that they could do better, but, at least we're in the fight here in California. Nationally, well, we were in the fight when the Inflation Reduction Act passed. That had a lot of really good
True.
features too, so we gotta get back to the point where we have a majority in Congress and we have a president that'll sign the bills and, we can be back in business, enjoying the Paris Agreement and all that kind
Mhm.
of stuff. That's all worth fighting for, and I think with the war in Iran, it adds a new dimension. We have to be opposed to this crazy military spending that's like and then thinking that Venezuelan oil is ours. I mean, all this stuff is like it's just straight out of the old imperialist playbook that we were opposed to going back to the Vietnam War. So we're
Yeah.
still in that same game, and I think that, being an activist is, for me, therapeutic. It's like, that's what makes me feel good because I could see that we can win, and, like, talking about feeling confident, like, yeah, we did end the war in Vietnam. It seemed like it was impossible. It went on year after year after year, and finally we got to the point where Congress wouldn't vote for any money for it, and that's what we need to do here too. Like, Congress needs to block this funding for this really ridiculous war,
Yeah.
and so we could win this, but it takes organizing and building a movement. That's the mission of 350 Bay Area is to build
Yeah,
a
tell us a little
movement.
bit about
Yeah.
350 Bay Area.
Well, that's the mission is to build a movement to end, carbon pollution and build a clean energy future with economic and environmental and social justice. So, like, that's all part of the vision. We want a good, clean energy future, and we think it can be a thriving future. We're not saying that people have to suffer in a I mean, the solar power is the cheapest form of power. We could do that. We can replace fossil fuels, have clean air, solve global warming, and do it for less money. I mean, how is that not a win-win-win, And,
I love your optimism and how easy you make it all sound. But I imagine this also weighs on you quite a bit. I mean, you've been through a lot and you're seeing patterns over and over and over again. I can imagine that could hit some people as very frustrating or disempowering or anxiety driving. How do you take care of yourself and keep moving?
well, you do have to take care of yourself. I mean, I'm pretty good at, like you say, keep moving. I swim and run and do all that stuff to stay healthy,
Yeah.
and I do that because I like being an activist. I mean, one time we were at a 350 East Bay meeting, and somebody said, "What would you like to be doing today?" And people were like, "Oh, I'd be in the garden, or I'd be at the beach," and I was like, "Actually, I'd like to be right here talking about climate. That's what I like to do." So, I mean, to me, it just feels good to be working on an issue. Bill McKibben is very inspirational. He started 350, our group. I don't know if you know what 350 is. A lot of people don't know.
No, tell us.
Okay, so the idea, Bill McKibben wrote a book about the end of nature back in the 80s or 90s. He's been writing about climate for a long, long time. But anyway, he was speaking with James Hansen, a famous climate scientist, and he said, "Well, what would be a safe level of CO2 in the atmosphere?" And James Hansen said, "Oh, maybe 350 parts per million, plus or minus, whatever." And so Bill said, "Well, okay, well, we'll shoot for that." And right now it's like 430. We're way over it. But the idea of having a number be the name of the organization, I think, is really great from a global warming point of view, because everybody in the world, I like to point out, use Arabic, stress on that word, Arabic numerals. And,
Hmm.
China, India, Africa, Latin America, once you explain what 350 means,
Yeah.
you don't have to translate it anymore because the numbers mean the same thing in every language. So that's why we name ourselves after a number, because
That makes a lot of
it's a
sense.
global problem.
Jack, thank you so much for sharing the story. I'd love to open it up for anybody who has any questions for us. It looks like Shruti, you have a question. Would you like
Yeah,
to share?
yeah, for sure. Jack, one thing I've found was really fascinating, especially in today's world, is that people are often tiptoeing around expressing opinions now because things are so polarized and it can be very incendiary just to be on two sides of the same conversation. How did you foster a relationship with someone on the other side and build that friendship, even though your opinions were on a hotly contested on the two sides of a hotly contested issue?
Well, I actually liked Rose Pack. She's a character. I mean, she's just like a really unforgettable person. And, except for the fact that I disagreed with her about the Embarcadero Freeway, I just totally respected what she had done as a community organizer, because I come kind of out of that organizing background, and I certainly never had the scope to do anything like what she had done. So it wasn't, I mean, I like people in general, but in her in particular, it wasn't hard to like her in my mind, and um, I think once she realized she wasn't going to win on I couldn't argue with her I didn't argue with her about anything, that wasn't going to be productive. But just to kind of make positive suggestions about, hey, if the central subway got built, you could get the access that you're talking about, blah, blah, blah. And
What I'm hearing there is that you kind of you anchored to what she was wanting with the freeway, which is
yeah, she
access
wanted
to.
access to Chinatown. Yeah, and pointing out that most people in Chinatown don't own cars. They don't have cars. So, like, why is the freeway helping them? Now, I also knew, you do a little research. She lived in Oakland. She drove to Chinatown every day. She used the Embarcadero Freeway. She was like, that was her personal pet thing. But somehow she convinced everybody else in Chinatown to go along with her when really they didn't use the Embarcadero Freeway, but she convinced people that their customers did. They were coming from East Bay, and they're gonna come eat at the Chinatown restaurants, and I don't know, I couldn't argue with that because I couldn't prove it one way or the other. But I don't try to pick fights. I'm not trying to pick fights.
I really like that framing. Would that be your advice? Because I do. Shruti, I think what you're touching on is just like we have people who are just not seeing eye to eye in this country, and in order to make progress, we do need to have a conversation and come across party lines or differing perspectives.
I think one thing that spoke to me that you mentioned was that it's finding where you do align, right? You had things in common with Rose Pack. There are a lot of people. I've traveled with my family through Alaska um, last year, and I was really concerned, because we're all of Indian descent, and so we were trying to um, figure out how we would be received there because they were largely Trump supporters. And we found that people were really receptive to just having a conversation. And in the day to day, a lot of people were just concerned about their wallet. They were upset with their politicians too. It's like a lot of the same themes run through people's general concerns. And I think to your point, finding where that consensus is goes a long way.
Ryan, do you have a question for Jack?
I do actually. Thank you. Uh, First of all, I want to say it was great to hear about the traffic diversion project that you worked on. I'm sure you're familiar with the city repair project in Portland, where they're really focusing on building community in neighborhoods and capitalizing on residential intersections and painting the streets and having a profound impact on the quality of life and community that comes out of that. So that would be a contextual basis for the question I have, which is a bit of a difficult one because it's a bit of a paradox in planning. And I have always wondered whether San Francisco would achieve a drive-through status when you're going up the 280, 101, Highway 1 corridor into Marin. Would the city benefit from having that be a continuous, nonstop, I guess you would have to call it a freeway that would somehow connect the peninsula to Marin through the Golden Gate Bridge? Would that be a beneficial impact in terms of community to the city by reducing traffic, the flow through traffic that has no business in the city and just wants to get, north? What would the balance be? Where's the tension there between the cost benefit to the city and having some kind of infrastructure that would allow for that versus, maybe the traffic loss that we're getting, or maybe the benefit of our communities without having that traffic?
Good question.
Yeah, well, that question I think gets to what good are freeways for Oakland, for example. Like I lived really close to 580, which was built, in my mind, primarily to support people leaving Oakland. It allows people to live out in Danville and Pleasanton and places like that, and and it took out all sorts of houses when it was built. How did this benefit Oakland? Like it's a help. It was a help for the overall regional urban sprawl. That's what it helped, and that was sort of the oil company's vision of what city planning should be, is like just sprawl out as much as possible. And so I would say the same thing. But San Francisco, I had a talk with a Caltrans engineer one time, and he said, "Oh, we've got to connect the freeways. You look on the map here. You got a freeway that, I showed you that mishmash of freeways that never got built." He was still, this was like in this, I think in 70 or something, I was talking to him. He still thought they should build these things. And, it would not, in my mind, benefit San Francisco. It would benefit anybody driving through San Francisco. So from a regional point of view, you could make the argument there's a benefit. I will admit, if I'm driving from a rare occasion where I might have been driving to try to get through San Francisco, you can take 19th Avenue, and it's a long, it takes a while to get through San Francisco. And you certainly,
Yeah, I do it all the time. I love Marin and I love that area, and I live in
yeah,
Mountain View, so
yeah,
it's gonna be a slog through 19th, no matter what.
right. You're paying the price, but my answer would be San Francisco itself wouldn't benefit. Yeah, the region in some ways would benefit, but not San Francisco necessarily itself.
That's really interesting because I grew up in Phoenix, and Phoenix is just all sprawl, right? Like it's very rare to find any tall buildings there. And the way the freeways are built is there's like Loop 101, and then outside of that is Loop 202, and outside of that is Loop 303. And so you have all of these freeways that just like, I think exactly what you're saying, encourage that sprawl. The people don't have to live downtown, which means there's not really any transit. Everything is just like really far out, and takes a really long time to get anywhere, and you have to go by freeway.
Yeah, most of those trade-offs were made in the era of the 50s and 60s, a lot when the freeways were built. And that's when I was studying transportation engineering, and there was the argument, we're just meeting demand. We're not trying to impose any of our values on what's going on. But what they later learned is if you build it, they will come. There's this thing called induced demand. If you make a freeway that makes the travel time much less, it's like by supply and demand, the law of supply and demand, you've created a new supply curve, and it causes the travel time to go down, which is the main determinant of your like I said, of your mode choice. So
Yeah.
it immediately pushes more people to drive when you do build a freeway. And that's something that was not talked about when I was in traffic engineering planning, but I think it became pretty widely understood later on.
Elliot has a question. What are your thoughts on autonomous vehicles, and how do you think they'll impact the future of transportation in San Francisco?
I don't know if you've read, Elliot, the book by Dan Sperling called Three Revolutions, and he's talking about the three revolutions in transportation. He was a UC Davis professor, and he was on the California Air Resource Board for a long time. Pretty thoughtful guy. And he's talking about the three revolutions being electric, autonomous, and shared. So first of all, the autonomous vehicles have to be electric, which every vehicle should be. Secondly, of course, there's still lots of safety issues and stuff that need to be worked out. But if we still have one person driving around in an autonomous vehicle, that's not solving our problems. I mean, it's if it's electric, at least that's better than gas. But the
Mm-hmm.
real solution is if you could get them to be shared. So, I mean, the vision that he talked about is like you don't own a car anymore. You just like these free vehicles are out there all the time. You just tap your phone, one comes up, and then it picks up people along the route that, are going where you're going. And so you have
Yeah.
2 or 3 or 4 people per vehicle. And so it actually addresses some of the congestion and problems like that. Anyway, so that's kind of what I would hope for is that kind of vision.
So, like Uber Pool and Lyft had their own version of it too, and I don't know if they still do, but it was that kind of concept. You could order an Uber and they'd come over, and then you'd go somewhere else and they do it. But I don't know if that really caught on. And so do you know what would incentivize people to extend their commute time just to buddy up?
Well, I used to take the casual carpool to work. I live in Oakland, and there was a thing called the casual carpool where you just stand near a bus stop and get in line, and cars come by and pick you up, and it worked great. I did it for 25 years. So,
Yeah.
um,
Yeah, and that gets you through the bridge without like paying a
right,
toll. And I think maybe there was HOV lane. Yeah.
it was the carpool lane, yeah.
Yeah, and Shruti's saying Uber Pool was cheaper too, so cost. So yeah, there are some levers there. Jack, is there anything I should have asked you that you wish I would have asked?
I could talk a little bit more about the current situation politically. I mean, in terms of change and 350 things that we're working on.
Yes, please.
California, I said, passed some good good bills. Like there was a bill, SB 32, which calls for a 40% reduction in greenhouse gases by 2030. Now, I don't think we're going to make that, but it's a good goal. And in fact, in 2016, I think is when it passed. That's when we formed our 350 Bay Area transportation team. And I thought at that time that the Metropolitan Transportation Commission would really get serious about climate change because all of a sudden the state had passed this bill. And I've been
What does the
disappointed.
Metropolitan Transportation Commission do?
Okay, so they administer the funding and the planning operations for the Bay Area. They do something called Planned Bay Area, which actually has a lot of good features. But what I've been disappointed in that they don't do is they don't take responsibility for funding EV chargers. To me, EV chargers should be seen as infrastructure in the same way that traffic signals or repairing potholes or anything else. That should just be considered part of what we fund when we build roads, put in the conduits and stuff to make EV chargers.
Yeah.
I've never been able to convince MTC to do that, but the Bay Area Air Quality District has actually done more than MTC, which is kind of backwards to me because the Air District traditionally has only handled fixed sources and cars are mobile sources, but I guess the chargers themselves are fixed sources, so that's how they've gotten involved with it. But
Interesting.
so there's regional politics there that I think there's a lot of room that we could be doing a much better job at. I'd like to keep pushing on that in those directions.
Great. So if people want to learn more, where should they go?
Well, you can go to 350bayarea.org, and we have a link.
350 is something national or global?
Yeah, so that's a thing that gets a little confusing. There's a 350.org national and international organization, but they have not gotten too involved in like local politics. So there's
Okay.
like 100 local groups around the country or something.
Okay. So wherever people are listening from, they could find their local group and get involved that way.
There should be one in most. I heard somebody say they were from Phoenix. I'm not sure that there's one in Phoenix, but like in most of the big cities, there is a 350 group. And
There probably should be.
hope start one.
Yes.
But there are lots of climate groups, the Climate Reality Project, and the Sierra Club is always good. Ally, there's Center for Biological Diversity. I could rattle off 100 allies. So there's plenty of groups to get involved.
Send them over, and we'll put them in the show notes for anybody who wants to go through them. But Jack, this has been a really, really great conversation. I appreciate you sharing your stories so transparently and candidly, and your perspectives on what we need to do and how we've gotten ourselves into the place we're at today. So just thank you so much. And thank you, everybody, for listening and for your questions. Super thoughtful.
Okay, well, thanks for having me. I really enjoyed it.
Same. Jack has so many great stories. But the one I keep coming back to is how he talked about Rose Pack. His most powerful opponent on the freeway teardown became an ally on the Central Subway. The freeway vote came down to 6-5, and Jack's side won by 1 vote. And then he went to Rose Pack, and he offered her something she could win on instead. He never argued with her. He listened for what she actually wanted, which was access to Chinatown. And he helped her get it. In today's political landscape, that's the most powerful tool we have. Not listening to agree, listening to find what's actually being asked for. I'd love to hear what stood out to you in this conversation. Share this episode with somebody who thinks their job doesn't count for the climate. Or drop me a comment on YouTube. Thank you to Jack for his stories and his time. And thank you to our audience for their Q&A. And thank you to Carl, the Climate Action Resource Library, for helping co-host this episode. I'm Louisa Henry, and this is Any Job Can Be a Climate Job. I'll see you next time.